Welcome to Studio Sacramento. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is the largest estuary of the west coast of the United States. The Delta transports snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada across the state and provides water to 2/3 of Californians. The Delta is also home to the agricultural, economic, environmental, and recreational diversity of California. Ultimately, the Delta, though, is about water. Who owns it? Who controls it? What it's used for? And who gets to make the decisions? Today's show is in partnership with the local chapter of the American Leadership Forum, an organization where leaders come together to unite, strengthen, and serve for the benefit of all of our community. ALF has helped us select today's guests. Also, a studio audience has joined us today. And our guests are three individuals, all with a long history on Delta issues. Mike McGowan, Yolo County Board of Supervisors, Environmental and Natural Resource Attorney Brenda Davis, and Dan Ray, Chief of Planning with California State Parks. Welcome all to the program.
Thanks.
Why does the Delta matter to our region and to all Californians? Brenda?
Its history, its culture, and its supply. It's vital to the economic growth and the way things thrive both inside the Delta and for the people who are served by the water that passes through it to get down south. And certainly the people north of the Delta take pride in what they're doing and their contributions to the overall welfare of the state. And the Delta is right in the middle of all of that. It's called a hub for a reason. So it's important.
Mike, from the perspective of a supervisor in a county that has a strong agricultural basis, what does the Delta mean to you and your constituents?
Well, the part of the Delta that is in Yolo County is a very thriving and important agricultural part of our county. The Clarksburg district is essentially in the primary zone of the Delta, and it's become a high-quality grape growing, wine grape growing area. About 11,000 acres are in cultivation right now, and so it's going from grape growing to winemaking to all of the other associated activities that go with that. So it's become an extremely important, value-added, high-quality, high-value crop for us in Yolo County.
It's interesting in that on a recent drive that I took, it's almost like we're springing our own small Napa Valley down in that part of the Delta.
Well, you don't want to get me started on that. I actually think that it is the next Napa Valley. It's much more important than people recognize. 11,000 acres in grapes, and we probably can double that over the course of time, which will lead us into some of our other conversation about concern about what's going to happen in the Delta as a result of a lot of the eco-restoration projects, which will be competing with some of the land that's currently used for agricultural products. But no question that the agriculture on all parts of the Delta are an incredibly important part of the Delta mix.
And Dan, from the state's perspective, you have to look over the entire state along with the rest of the state government. What are the big issues that the state is looking at right now with regards to the Delta?
Well, in addition to the water supply that the Delta provides, it's also a really critical part of our state's environment, not just within its own area, but sustains San Francisco Bay. Those of us who live in Sacramento or Stockton, we get to see the cranes that are flying around in the fall, or the waterfowl that might be out in the Yolo bypass, or maybe we go down fishing for bass or stripers in the Delta. But the salmon and steelhead that run through the Delta on their way to the ocean are important to not just the ecology of the Central Valley, but also to coastal fisheries. And it also is an important site for recreation. The Delta on an annual basis draws as many recreationists as Yosemite Valley or as all the coastal state parks from Morro Bay clear up through Monterey Bay. So that's a great place for us to have fun with our family and with our friends, and also supports a lot of jobs. It's recreation is one of the most important parts of the Delta economy.
Brenda, you have an interesting practice in that you represent people across the state. Mm-hmm. And is there a difference in perspective depending on your view of the Delta, depending on where it is that you live, whether you're south of the Delta or north of the Delta?
You bet. There's a lot of prejudice Even in Sacramento, you hear people say, don't let them have our water. And the assumption is that if people in LA and other places south of the Delta are able to get water more easily, then it's taking something away from people in the Delta or in Sacramento or in the northern areas. And there's a lot of polarization around who's going to get that water and when and how is it going to be pulled through the Delta.
Well, let me share something with all of you. According to a 2008 Sacramento-The series called The Delta Debate, the South State, quote, despite its reputation, has outpaced the Central Valley with regards to its conservation efforts. The Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Task Force found in 2007 the total water consumption in Southern California, both overall and on a per capita basis, has remained flat since 1990. The population has grown by about 10% or 1.5 million people, but per capita water consumption declined by 10%. Conversely, the Central Valley, meanwhile, saw population increase 20% in its total water consumption grow by the same amount. Per capita water consumption remained flat. In other words, Valley residents overall made no progress on water conservation. Based on these statistics, Mike, can the North still really consider the South a villain?
Well, I don't think it should. In some ways, we are competing for a limited resource. First off, I think there's no question that the north part of the state has to do a much better job about water recycling and water conservation. We just haven't done it to the extent that we should have. And that leaves open, quite frankly, then the argument for folks in other parts of the state to say, you're not doing your job, ergo we're going to take some of that water. The question is how we balance the interests of water to be diverted for other valuable, important purposes, but also maintain enough water really through the Delta to continue to provide for the economic, the agricultural, the recreational, the environmental features that you mentioned in your opening. And that's really the real debate here, not whether we're conserving enough or not, because we should conserve more. We all should conserve more. And actually they can do even a better job throughout the state, including in the Southland as well. So I think the real debate is how we do these things, not that we shouldn't restore the Delta and protect the Delta in all of its features, but also we have to figure out a way to have water reliability for the state.
But how do these conservation efforts and mitigation efforts, how do they affect the regular family, farmer, business owner within the region? For instance, in terms of mitigation agreements and things like that. How does that play out and impact our region?
Well, you mentioned mitigation. Well, first off, on the conservation issue, as an example, in the grape growing area and throughout the Delta, most of the farmers are going to drip irrigation. So those conservation measures, like they are down in the Central Valley and the southern part of the state, those measures are being taken into account now. You talk about mitigation. Let's go right to that. If we need to take lands, if the state, as a state policy, needs to take lands currently in the Delta and convert them from agricultural use to environmental restoration, then yes, there needs to be a meaningful process by which we not only convert the land, but we mitigate the farmer, the landowner, and the local jurisdiction for the loss of that land.
Can you help us understand what is the cause for that process taking place where you're taking usable farmland offline in order to use it for environmental mitigation or restoration?
Regardless of what happens in the Delta, whether there's a peripheral canal, a large one, a small one, or there's a through Delta conveyance system, or whatever we wind up with, there is going to be the need for, some say as many as 100,000, or certainly a lot of acreage, put into wetlands, back into swamps almost, for the fish population to come back to a healthy state. And that's going to be land conversions of some kind. And that is a fundamental issue, a fundamental part of the whole Delta restoration process. And we're going to have to somehow figure how that's done, how it's done equitably, fairly, and as you suggest, that the proper mitigations are there for the local jurisdictions, for the farm and landowners.
Dan, on this environmental restoration issue and its impact on recreation, things like fishing, and what are the major issues right now that the state is confronting
Well, I think one of the real questions is, as Mike mentioned, it's the scope and location of what restoration is done. I think that science is increasingly showing that we're not going to be able to sustain our salmon, steelhead populations, sturgeon, other fish that are important in the Delta if we can't restore some of the habitats that were cleared up for farming decades ago. And really, so a key thing is, where is that going to be? How big is it going to be? What's the pace at which we develop it? You look at what's happening in San Francisco Bay today with thousands of acres of new habitat being restored in former salt ponds. That's built on decades of experiments and kind of incremental approaches that have helped them learn how to proceed. Here in the Delta, we're just beginning to try some restoration work. And so we've got great projects in the Yola Bypass, for example, and some new ideas coming online in the Oakley shoreline down in Contra Costa County. But that's another real challenge, is making sure we get it right.
Brenda, speaking of that, is the science there in terms of being able to actually adequately address the issues facing the Delta, like restoration and mitigation?
Yes and no. There's science there. The question is whether the science that is available is being used, or if it's being cherry-picked and to a certain extent ignored. As an example, when you're talking about specific species like the Delta smelt and the salmon, very popular in the news, very big court decisions just coming out talking about the fact that the science was sloppy and was not well tested, but was still used to make a case about, okay, what are we going to do for the fisheries? It's putting the cart before the horse to say we need to restore everything, and everything we do, more water means better fish. You have to look at, do you understand their life cycles? Do you understand when you're doing things, whether those things are going to be the best and most effective? And because you're affecting people all around you. You're taking land out of production. You're asking people to put up millions of dollars. You're asking them to do things to help you manage a system when you don't even really know if what you're doing is going to be effective. And we think we see from all of the statistics about the fisheries that it's not being effective. So maybe you're not doing the right thing. Step back and get your science in order. Improve the science.
What misconception do you think that the public holds most closely to that is not supported by the science?
Well, I'm going to be very controversial here and say...
Bring it.
The public believes, because it's been the mantra, everything could be solved if we could just ramp down the pumps and take some of these agricultural lands out of production and create new habitat, and then let all that water that would be pumped out of the Delta flow into these habitat areas and out into the ocean. And then everybody's going to be happy as long as we keep doing it and we spend enough money and we spend enough time doing just that, then everything's going to be resolved. And, you know, we've been down this path for about 16 or 17 years, and it just hasn't been true, and the science doesn't bear it out. So,
and conversely, what does the science bear out in terms of solutions that are implementable?
The science bears out in terms of implementable solutions that you have to take a more holistic approach, that there are any number of things happening in a dynamic ecosystem like the Delta. You've got shipping, you've got recreation, you've got people building new suburbs and converting land that was agricultural into development. You've got different people discharging things into the Delta. All of that is in the mix. None of that can be isolated from the overall look at, okay, what are all the things that are going in? And we look at, you know, we focus in on the things that appear to have the most influence,
okay,
and try to deal with those things.
So what Brenda's point reminds me of, Mike, is this. There was a process that was created called CalFed. And that was supposed to bring all the stakeholders to the table so that way there could be holistic solutions that ultimately moved the state of the Delta forward. What is CalFed, and has it worked?
No, CalFed has not worked. It was an experiment that I think failed, well largely because they weren't able to really get they weren't able to get people to the table to come to any form of agreement. And I'm not sure we're going to get there with this process, although